So Princess Anne just did something that nobody in the royal family saw coming. And the reason it happened now, after all these years, is honestly the part that makes this story impossible to walk away from. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't sit down with a journalist. She didn't leak anything through an aide or authorize some carefully worded palace statement designed to say nothing while appearing to say everything. What she did was far more dangerous than any of that. She opened a letter written by her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, years before she died, a letter that was never meant to be read by anyone except the person it was addressed to. And when Princess Anne finished reading it, she made a decision that sent shockwaves through the entire Windsor family, because what was inside that envelope didn't just change Anne's understanding of her mother, it changed her understanding of everything the monarchy had been doing for the last decade. And she decided the family needed to hear it, whether they wanted to or not. To understand what Anne did with that letter, you first have to understand the woman who was holding it. Princess Anne has spent her entire royal life being the person nobody worries about. That sounds like a compliment. It isn't. It means she has been overlooked, underestimated, and quietly depended upon by every member of her family for over 5 decades without ever receiving the kind of attention or credit that follows the heir or the spare or the crisis of the week. She is the hardest working member of the royal family by every measurable standard. Year after year, she completes more official engagements than any other senior royal, more than Charles, more than William, more than anyone. She does it without fanfare, without a personal brand strategy, without a streaming deal, and without ever once suggesting that she deserves applause for showing up. That consistency is not accidental, it is inherited. Elizabeth raised her daughter to believe that royal duty was not a performance, but a contract. You do the work. You protect the institution. You do not complain, and you do not explain. Anne absorbed that philosophy so completely that she became, in a very real sense, invisible, not because she lacked presence. Anyone who has ever watched her shut down a journalist mid-question knows that is not the case. But because she never competed for attention, she simply worked. And in a family that has spent the last several years tearing itself apart over who gets the spotlight and who controls the narrative, the person who never saw it either became the most trusted figure in the building. That is why the letter ended up with her. And that is why what she did with it carries weight that no one else in the family could replicate. Here is how it happened. According to accounts that have emerged from inside the royal household, the letter was discovered during a private review of Queen Elizabeth's personal papers at Windsor Castle. Not the state papers, not the official correspondence that gets archived and cataloged by the Royal Archives. The personal papers, the ones kept in a private writing desk in her sitting room, the room where she took her afternoon tea, where she watched racing on television, where she wrote by hand to the people who mattered to her most. A member of the household staff found the envelope during a careful reorganization of that space. It was sealed, undated on the outside, and addressed in Elizabeth's unmistakable hand to Anne. Just Anne. No title, no formality, no Princess Royal. Just her daughter's name. The staff member brought it to Charles's private secretary, who brought it to the king. Charles held the envelope, studied the handwriting, and made a decision that says more about his relationship with his sister than almost anything else in recent memory. He did not open it. He did not ask what was inside. He did not route it through advisors or constitutional review. He walked it to Anne personally and placed it in her hands without a word of instruction. Then he left the room. Anne waited until she was alone. She sat in the chair by the window, the same window her mother had looked through thousands of times, and opened this seal with a letter opener that had belonged to Prince Philip. The contents reportedly ran to several handwritten pages. Elizabeth's handwriting, always precise but never cold, filled the paper with the kind of directness that she rarely allowed herself in public. And here is where the story becomes something far more significant than a sentimental discovery. because what that letter contained was not simply a mother's farewell to her daughter. It was Elizabeth's private assessment of the monarchy's future, written during a period when she could already see the cracks forming, when she was watching the institution she had spent 70 years protecting begin to fracture under the weight of personal grievances, public feuds, and the slow erosion of the silence she believed had kept the crown intact. Before we go further, real quick, if you're into deep dives on royal stories that actually sit with the complexity instead of just picking a side, hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We're building something good. Okay, back to it. The letter reportedly addressed several things, but three passages in particular are the ones that have reverberated through the family since Anne shared them. The first concerned Charles directly. Elizabeth, by these accounts, wrote with remarkable honesty about her fears for his reign, not his ability. She never doubted his ability, but his tendency to let personal loyalty override institutional judgment. She reportedly described a pattern she had watched develop over decades, a pattern where Charles would delay difficult decisions because the person affected was someone he loved. She did not name Camilla specifically in this passage, but the implication, according to those who have been briefed on the letter's contents, was unmistakable. Elizabeth believed that a king who could not separate affection from authority would eventually be forced to choose between the two, and she feared the delay would cause more damage than the decision itself ever could. That passage alone would have been enough to send tremors through the family. But the second section hit harder because it addressed Harry. Elizabeth reportedly wrote about her grandson with a tenderness that is difficult to reconcile with the public image of a monarch who rarely displayed emotion. She described the boy she had watched grow up inside the palace walls, the child who reminded her so much of his mother's warmth and his grandfather's restlessness. But then the tone shifted. She wrote that Harry's pain was real and his grievances were not invented, but that the decision to convert private suffering into public commerce had crossed a line she could not endorse. She reportedly used a phrase that Anne has since repeated privately to senior family members. She wrote that grief shared for healing is courage, but grief sold for profit is something else entirely. That distinction, coming from Elizabeth, coming from the woman who buried her own father, her sister, her mother, and her husband without ever once turning those losses into spectacle, carries a moral authority that no living member of the family can match. And Anne, reading those words in her mother's handwriting, understood immediately why they mattered now more than ever. The third passage was addressed to Anne herself, and this is the section that reportedly broke her composure entirely. Elizabeth wrote that of all her children, Anne was the one who had understood the contract best, the duty without applause, the service without explanation, the refusal to place personal feeling above institutional obligation. But then Elizabeth added something that Anne had never heard her mother say in life. She wrote that she regretted not telling Anne more often how much that steadiness had meant to her. She admitted that the crown's demand for restraint had sometimes made her a better queen than she was a mother, and she asked Anne to forgive her for the conversations they should have had, but never did because protocol always seemed more urgent than honesty. Anne reportedly set the letter down, pressed both hands against the desk, and sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes before calling anyone. When she finally moved, she did not call an advisor. She did not call a press secretary. She called William. The Prince of Wales arrived at Windsor within the hour. Anne met him without ceremony, without preamble, and without the careful diplomatic language that usually governs conversations between senior royals. She told him what the letter contained. She read him specific passages. And then she told him that the family needed to hear their mother's words together in the same room, without staff, without aides, and without the option to leave before it was finished. William agreed immediately. He later told Catherine that Anne's voice during that conversation carried something he had never heard from her before. Not anger, not grief exactly, something closer to authority. The authority of a woman who had received a direct commission from the late Queen and intended to carry it out, regardless of the discomfort it would cause. Charles was informed that same evening. His reaction, according to household accounts, was complicated. He asked whether the letter mentioned him. Anne said it did. He asked whether it was critical. Anne paused before answering. She told him it was honest, which was worse. Charles closed his eyes briefly, then agreed to attend. The family gathering took place 3 days later in a private drawing room at Windsor. No staff were permitted inside, no phones, no recording devices. Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, and Edward were present. The absence of one name from that room was noted by everyone and discussed by no one. Harry was not invited. Anne had made that decision herself, and when William questioned it, she explained her reasoning with a clarity that ended the discussion. The letter, she said, contained Elizabeth's honest assessment of the damage caused by public grievances. Reading it aloud to the person most directly implicated in that damage, in a room full of the people most directly wounded by it, would not serve healing. It would serve spectacle. And spectacle, she reminded them, was exactly what their mother had spent her life resisting. Anne stood at the head of the room. She did not sit. She held the letter in both hands, and she read it from beginning to end without interruption. The room was silent throughout. Charles reportedly looked at the floor during the passage about delayed decisions. Camilla studied her own hands. William sat motionless, his jaw set. Catherine pressed her fingertips together and did not look away from Anne's face once. Edward covered his mouth at one point and turned toward the window. When Anne finished, she placed the letter on the table in the center of the room and told the family that their mother had written those words because she believed the monarchy's survival depended on the people inside it choosing the institution over themselves. Not once, not during a crisis, every single day. Then she said something that, by every account, became the defining moment of the gathering. She told them that Elizabeth had never feared the monarchy's enemies. She had feared its family, because enemies could be managed. Family could not be controlled without destroying the thing that made them a family in the first place. Charles spoke first. He admitted that his mother had been right about the delays. He acknowledged that avoiding difficult decisions to protect the people he loved had sometimes endangered the institution they were all responsible for protecting. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood what he meant. William spoke next. He said the letter confirmed what he had believed for years, that the monarchy's greatest threat was not public opinion or media hostility or political change. It was the assumption that royal blood entitled you to use the institution's platform for personal purposes. He did not name his brother. He did not need to do that either. Catherine said very little, but what she said reportedly landed with precision. She told the room that the letter reminded her why she had chosen this life, not the ceremonies or the titles or the visibility, the contract, the agreement that service came before self. She said Elizabeth's words should not be treated as a relic, but as a standing order. Camilla asked one question. She wanted to know whether the letter would ever be made public. Anne answered immediately and without hesitation. No, the letter was private. It would remain private. It would not be leaked, summarized, excerpted, or referenced in any official communication. Their mother had written it for her family, not for the nation, and Anne intended to honor that boundary absolutely. Edward asked what would happen to the physical letter. Anne told him she would keep it at her home at Gatcombe Park, locked in a private safe, alongside a small collection of handwritten notes from both her parents that she had preserved for decades. She said she considered herself the custodian, not the owner, and that the letter would eventually pass to the next generation when the time was right. The family sat with the weight of what they had heard for a long time. No one rushed to fill the silence, and that silence, Anne later told a trusted confidant, was the most honest conversation the Windsors had shared in years. The gathering ended without a formal resolution, without a communique, without a 5-point action plan. It ended the way Elizabeth would have wanted it to end. Quietly, privately, with the understanding that what had been said in that room would shape behavior, not headlines. But here is the part that makes this story genuinely significant beyond the drama of the moment. Because in a family that has spent the last several years watching its private pain become public entertainment, watching handshakes analyzed for warmth, seating charts decoded for hostility, and every glance weaponized by commentators desperate for the next chapter, Anne did something almost radical. She took the most explosive piece of royal correspondence in recent memory and kept it inside the family. She did not sell it. She did not stream it. She did not convert it into a content opportunity. She did not even hint at its existence outside the room where it was read. The world learned about it, not because Anne wanted attention, but because someone in the periphery of the household shared enough fragments for the story to surface. And even then, even now, the full contents remain private. The exact words remain with the family. That restraint is not dramatic. It does not generate views. It does not trend. But it is the single most Elizabeth thing anyone in the Windsor family has done since the Queen died. And the person who did it was the one who never sought the spotlight, never fought for the narrative, never once confused duty with performance. So here is the question I want you to carry out of this video. Was Anne right to keep Harry out of the room? Was Elizabeth right to put those assessments on paper? And does a letter from a dead queen still carry the authority to change a living monarchy? There is no clean answer, and anyone who gives you one quickly is not sitting with the full weight of the question. What we know is this: a woman who spent her life saying nothing finally said everything, not in a broadcast, not in a memoir, not from a palace balcony, in a handwritten letter that her daughter opened alone beside a window and then carried into a room full of the people it was meant to reach. The next chapter of this family is being written by the words of a woman who is no longer here to speak them, and the person chosen to deliver them was the one who had spent her entire life proving she could be trusted with silence. When that chapter moves, we will be here to talk about it. If this video made you see any part of this story differently, drop your position in the comments. I read every one of them. And on a question this complicated, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you're not already with us, because the next chapter is coming and it is going to be one worth watching.